Nero's story does not begin with the silk and jewelry on display in the Forum. It begins in a family theater of ambition, far from the glare of public pageantry but just as lethal. He arrived at the Purple Throne at 16, a boy still learning how to close his fingers around a ring and understand the terrible geometry of command. To call him an unformed figure is accurate and incomplete. Nero had been shaped by the hands of others, most notably his mother Agrippina, a woman of a lineage that read like a ledger of Rome's finest and its most dangerous. She was the sort of mother who understood the sacrifices that accompanied dynastic calculations. She knew how to turn marriages, deaths, and alliances into ladders. When Nero was placed on the throne, many Romans inhaled a cautious optimism. He was young, and youth carries the promise of reform, the possibility that an empire could be steered away from the calcified interests that had ossified under older emperors. Around that adolescent body stood two men who were, in many ways, caretakers of his mind and his temper. Seneca, the philosopher and rhetorician, provided a visage of moral seriousness. Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, supplied muscle and practical steadiness. They were the moderating architecture, the scaffolding that allowed a raw talent to walk without tumbling. Under their tutelage, Nero did things that won him genuine affection among common Romans. Taxes eased, grain dole and public entertainment swelled. Theaters became arenas for the people's joy. The young emperor took to public performance, strange for a man of so much power, but fitting in a culture that loved spectacle. He sang, he played. He rode in chariots not only to be seen but to be cheered, and the cheering became a kind of currency. To the populace, he was less a distant deity and more a performer who shared their laughter. It was tempting, for a while, to read these acts as the gestures of a populace no less than a ruler. To the poor, a generous festival meant bread and respite. To a public hungry for distraction, Nero's theatricals were balm. But power moves through habits, and habits harden into dispositions. The more Nero learned that applause could fill a gap in his life, the more he sought spectacles to keep the ache at bay. Performance discreetly segued into dependency, narrative into necessity. The instruments of public favor, gala games, lowered levies, artistic triumphs were not ends so much as scaffolds propping up a fragile interior. And so the boy emperor began to change in ways that were subtle until they became obvious. It is easy to point a finger and say absolute power corrupts. The truth is often quieter and more human. Imagine being a young man whose entire identity is reflected back by a sea of faces chanting your name. The reflection magnifies, then distorts. One begins to expect that the world moves for the performance. Contradiction becomes intolerable. Advice becomes an irritation. People who once dared speak their minds grow cautious, then silent. In that silence, illusions take root. The empire is a mirror polished by flattery until a ruler believes he resembles the image more than the man. Nero's early measures, reducing some taxes, funding lavish public entertainments, even participating personally in performances, were genuinely popular. Rome's masses could see a benefit in his rule. But the infrastructure of imperial power is not merely the warm glow of popularity. It is an apparatus of influence that can easily be rerouted from public welfare into private consolation. When those in power learn they can buy human voices with favors, when they learn they need no longer listen to counsel that hurts, the machinery of governance skews toward the personal. It is here, in the shifting of gravity from common good to private desire, that Nero's decline becomes less a moral failing and more a systemic one. Agrippina's handsharp, often unseen, did not help. Her style of influence planted the idea that rule was a family inheritance and that family disputes could be settled in corridors rather than in open debate. She had known the mechanisms of Roman aristocratic life intimately and could make them work. but mothers who wield crowns often do so at the cost of the ruler's freedom. Agrippina's guardianship meant Nero was never fully president of himself. His inclinations were preformed by a woman who knew the currency of ambition. That currency, once spent, always needs replenishing. Still, for a time, the court buzzed with a hopeful noise. Plays were written glorifying the city. Aqueducts and porticos received attention. There was a sense, however fragile, that Rome might have its glory renewed by a ruler who both loved and was loved. The reconciliation of artistry and administration felt plausible in those moments. Yet even as public works rose and festivals lit the night, small fissures began to show in the palace life, debates that ended in threats, advisors suddenly withdrawn from view, favors doled out to those whose loyalty could be guaranteed with titles and estates. Power, when conducted in the glaring light of performance, breeds dependency upon applause. Nero's willingness to put himself in the public eye on stage, in chariot races, in singing contests reinforced a feedback loop. The more he performed, the more he required stagecraft to stay stable. And stagecraft, by its nature, privileges spectacle over substance. The danger of empire in these conditions is that the visible triumphs obscure the invisible rot. The brass of parades dazzles, the ledger books less so. What matters in the forum is how the crowd applauds, not how the grain stores hold. One must not forget, though, the human threads that ran through this transformation. Nero was not a cartoon villain. He was a man who, in youth, genuinely pursued pleasures and reforms he believed in. He could be generous. He could be charismatic and even strangely sincere. He also learned, dangerously, to conflate his personal desires with the public interest. When an emperor begins to see the world as an extension of his will, when private sorrow becomes an imperial problem, disaster is no longer a possibility but a method. And it is here that the scene begins to darken. The availability of absolute decision-making, the lack of meaningful restraint, the very human need to be loved. Within this pressure cooker of personality and machinery, the arrival of Poppaea Sabina would mark the next inflection point. She would not so much create the ruin as reveal the vulnerabilities Nero had been cultivating all along. A woman of luminous presence, of political instinct and appetite, she arrived already cupped in rumor and possibility. To watch Nero in those earlier years was to watch a man building a private theater in a public city. Poppaea would be both his lead actor and the script that forced the stage to collapse. Before the collapse, there was still a sense, the fragile optimism of those who remembered the early days, that the boy could be a man who governed well. But the apparatus that allowed him to perform also enabled his absolutes. The applause that once united the city would, step by careful step, blind the court to the tragedies being formed in private rooms. That is the anatomy of dissent, small concessions to vanity, morph into the grander acts that hollow out governance and leave behind the beings who are most vulnerable, those whose lives are treated as materials for repair. For now, though, the story remains a promise. Young Nero will continue to charm and to fail, to give and to take. In the next act of this unfolding tragedy, an incandescent woman steps onto the stage and everything changes.